Thank you, Melissa. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a very interesting topic. It's an interesting time to be doing it because yesterday was the anniversary of Kristallnacht, 82 years ago in Germany. And anyone whose relatives, family were in Germany at that time, they would certainly were affected by that. And this story is no different. So I'm going to start off first with a little short video that will kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about tonight. And this is from a film made by the Filipino-American filmmaker Noel Izon. He lives in the DC area now, but he's from the Philippines, and he made a film about the rescue of Jews by the Philippines. And this will give us a little bit of a foundation. I'm going to start it now.
Time came when I wasn't allowed to walk on the sidewalk because some of the boys came towards me and said, "You're a Jew, you walk on the street."
We would see benches that would say, "Dogs and Jews not allowed."
People were nasty to them on the street. People who had used to be friends were no longer friendly, pretended not to know them.
The brown shirts came and went up and down the house, destroyed everything.
It was a little unruly on the streets, and the people in the department store told them what was happening. And what was happening was that all the Jewish stores were getting broken into, the synagogues were getting broken into.
What happens next is they're trying to think of where they could possibly go.
He offered the country as a sanctuary for refugees. It was just the right thing to do as far as he was concerned. It was just the mere humanity of it and his feeling for empathy for a persecuted people.
And for me, this was heaven. And I right away loved the Philippines.
When you saw how the doors were basically closed to all of us except the Philippines, and how the Filipino people are a very warm people. They're a very friendly people.
It was my home. And it always will be.
Okay. Going to get started now with the program. That was a little bit of an introduction, so you can get an idea that, and there are still survivors around, and I'm not sure, but Lottie Hirschfield, one of the ladies in the video, may be with us tonight. I hope she is, and if she is, later in the questions, she can make herself visible, I hope. Anyway, this program got started because of my grandmother. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about this. Excuse me a second here. Elsie Gobble, my grandmother, was one of the Jews who ended up in the Philippines. She was from Hamburg, and here's a little bit about Elsie. And you can see she was a little, looked like a bit of a flapper from Germany back in the 1920s. Born in 1909 in Hamburg to Joseph and Basi Gobble, who were immigrants from Poland, and she was the youngest of 9 children in a prosperous family. Her father was a wholesaler, a cheese wholesaler, had a good business. In 1927, she became pregnant, and she was not married, and she was just 18. She was pregnant with my mother, and in those days, it was not common for an unmarried woman to keep her child. So she gave my mother up for adoption in 1928, as soon as my mother was born. And they never met again, and I never met Elsie, but this is her story that I've been able to put together through my research after finding her family. When their business, the Goebbels business, was seized by the Nazis in the early 30s after Hitler came to power, most of them chose to emigrate to Palestine. A brother did go to the US, and so did one of her sisters, but Elsie remained in Germany. Family stories, which I'll talk a lot about during this presentation, have it that she wandered around Germany. She had a nervous breakdown. I believe she was very upset at having to have given up her only child. To help her escape from Germany as things deteriorated, her father in Palestine was able to arrange a marriage for her to a wealthy man from Breslau named Gunther Hamburger. And they left the country. They were married November 7th, 1938, just 2 days before Kristallnacht. So you know how treacherous things were already getting in Germany. And they left the country very quickly after that. So sometime at the end of 1938, they boarded a ship. But there are still many questions that I haven't answered. And this is a photograph that I acquired relatively recently of Elsie and Gunther that I think may have had something to do with their marriage. So how did they leave Germany? How did they get out? Well, I'm actually still researching this. One story has it that they got on a cruise ship. That was the only way they could pretend they were going on vacation and would come back, because they didn't have a visa to get into another country, as far as I know, and as far as I still know. So did they get on a cruise ship? But where? Did they have visas to enter the Philippines? I have not found evidence that they did. Could they have been headed for Shanghai? Well, by the end of the 30s, Shanghai was already growing had a Jewish community that was growing quite large. They had nearly 17,000 Jewish refugees by the end of 39 because visas were not required. So maybe that's where they originally had planned to go. Well, they ended up in Manila instead, and they settled into life on a street called Nebraska. Many streets were named because it was an American territory. Many streets were named for the American states. So she mailed photos to her family in Palestine. In one of them, she is with Frank Hamburger, who is this young man here, who I just didn't know who he was. Who's Frank Hamburger? Could that have been Gunther? But he looked awfully young to me, had this photo for years. Elsie had a habit of always writing on the back of the photos that what date and where the photo was taken. So here it says Elsie and Frank Hamburger. Who was he? I don't know. Here's a photo of Elsie taken a little later. This is 1940. This is 41. She's on the beach, possibly Manila Bay. So who were the Hamburgers? Well, in 1997, I found Elsie's family in the US and Israel. My mother had died in 1991 and Elsie had died in 1995. And the family told me about Elsie's escape to Manila and had shared her many photos with me. Very little was known about Gunther, other than he had died at the end of the war. In early 2019, a clue on Facebook led me to Rob Hamburger, Gunther's great nephew. He didn't know who Elsie was, but he had many photos of her in his family albums. And I sent him the picture that I had of Elsie and Frank. And who was Frank? Frank was his father, who somehow spent a few years in the Philippines. So here are some pictures that Rob Hamburger in San Francisco has sent me. This is Elsie, there's Gunther, and here's Elsie with a bunch of men, boarders in a house, I don't know, but she looks very happy. Here she is again with Frank and Gunther, and they're in Manila. So another interesting photo. And here's another one. Rob Hamburger sent me this photo. And this photo I had in my files, but I had totally forgotten about it. So when I got this photo from Rob, I thought, oh, this must have been taken in Germany, because here's Frank's grandmother, Gertrude Hamburger, and Elsie. Well, I had no knowledge that Elsie and Gertrude were ever in Manila together. I just thought they must have been in Germany and met there before the marriage. Then I found this photo again, and clearly you can see these two photos were taken on exactly the same day. So and Elsie, as I said, always wrote on the back, and she wrote in German. If for anyone out there who speaks German, she wrote mit unserer Schwiegermutter, with my mother-in-law, in front of our house, for unser Haus. And in this photo, they were living on Dakota Street in the Malate section of Manila. And so somehow in 1939, Gertrude was in Manila along with Frank. I later learned that Gertrude, and I have records, Gertrude and her other two sons actually emigrated to Shanghai, and they made a stop in Manila. And I've also recently learned that the ship stopped in Manila before taking people to Shanghai. So this is how they were there. Gertrude actually died in Shanghai during World War II. And here's another photo that really touched me. This is Elsie in the Philippines, obviously, and she's holding a little baby. And I believe she always regretted all her life that she had to give up her own baby. So this photo really, showed me that she did love children, and I'm sure she really missed having her own. And she never did have another biological child after my mother. Nobody knew anything about this part of her life. So how did this all start? How did Elsie end up in the Philippines? How did the Jews end up in the Philippines? A lot of people don't know about this history because it's really been written about pretty recently. So it's important to learn a little bit about the Philippines. So the Philippines is a land of 7,000 islands in the South China Sea here. You can see it's near Southeast Asia, Vietnam. It's near Malaysia. Of course, South China Sea is pretty vast here. So the two major islands are Mindanao and Luzon, and Manila is on the island of Luzon. And between the 16th and 19th centuries, the Philippines were ruled by Spain. It was not a friendly ruling. They made the native Filipinos give up their own surnames and take Spanish surnames, which is why when you meet Filipinos, oftentimes they'll have a Spanish surname, but that's not how their own families and ancestors started out. Conversos, who were Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity after the Spanish Inquisition, had begun to travel to Manila, but as conversos, they still were persecuted. They were not given equal rights. So it was, even though they were merchants at times, and doing business, they didn't have many rights, and they could be subject to persecution, arrest, whatever. In 1869, a major event was the opening of the Suez Canal. Now, instead of having to sail clear around the Cape Horn of Africa, they could now go to the Philippines and to all of Asia via the Suez Canal. So this also opens up trade even more for Jewish merchants who were already doing some business in that part of the world. So another very seminal event that we start to know about from our American history is the Spanish-American War, which started to really open the door. There was a lot of unrest against Spanish rule, and it increased in the 1890s. And it was happening both in Cuba, which was under Spanish rule, as well as the Philippines. But we as Americans tend to be more familiar with what happened in Cuba. And the major event that precipitated the war was the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. And many of us learned about Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and their victory in Cuba, but not a lot was said in our history books about Commodore George Dewey, who led the US Navy in the Battle of Manila Bay back in 1898. And that was also very significant. This painting is actually of the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor. And for many years, Remember the Maine, before Remember Pearl Harbor, Remember the Maine was a big cry in the US. So a Jewish community could start to form now because the US took control of the Philippines, $20 million in the Treaty of Paris. So among the American troops, some of the Jewish troops actually just took their discharges in Manila. This opened up businesses by Americans started to open there, and Jewish entrepreneurs from the US started to get contracts with those businesses and began to open their own businesses there. A man named Emil Bachrach arrived in 1901. He became very prosperous, and he would figure very prominently in the start of the synagogue, the first temple in Manila, called Temple Emil after him. In 1911, a Jewish school teacher and his bride, Morton Isidore and Catherine Netzorg, arrived in the US to join the new Philippine Public School Teacher Corps. So they became the early teachers coming from America. And hang on to that name, we'll hear about him. Their son would become the first bar mitzvah in the Philippines. So this community started growing, not by leaps and bounds, but it started growing. So by the end of World War I, there were 150 Jewish families, pay no attention to that ringing, Jewish families in Manila. In 1919, the Jewish community was formally organized. The synagogue, as I said, was named for Emil Bachrach, who had pledged a lot of support. They broke ground for the synagogue in 1922, and they sent Mahel Goldstein to Shanghai, which was a lot closer than going to Europe, and to find a rabbi. And he returned with Israel Konigsberg, the first rabbi, and he officiated at the very first Rosh Hashanah service in 1924. Soon after was that first bar mitzvah. So here's a picture of Temple Emil, and as you can see, it was an absolutely beautiful structure, a lot of Moorish influences, and probably from this, maybe there was a Spanish architect there, but you can see these beautiful arches here and the spires, just a lovely building, a gorgeous fence. I mean, they were very, very proud of this beautiful structure. This is a map, very basic map of some of the streets in that area. So I could show you, here's Manila Bay over here on the, I think that's the west side. And you have this district or Mito where a lot of the Jews lived. And here are two of the streets that Elsie and Gunther lived on. And here's where the temple was, just a couple blocks away from where they were. They also, I believed, later moved down to this district as well. The first Jewish refugees began arriving in the late 30s as things became worse in Germany, but they didn't come from Germany. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. By the way, here's a photograph of Manuel Quezon taking the oath as president, but the Philippines were still a US protectorate. So it was an independent nation, but he did become president, and that's significant for the Jews. As early as 1933, German Jews began emigrating to Asia, as I mentioned, and their numbers were growing quite a lot in Shanghai. Alex and Philip Frieder, American brothers who were in the tobacco business, were quite prominent there, and they would figure very prominently in the rescue efforts that were to come. The first wave of Jewish refugees actually came from Shanghai due to the Nazis' alliance with Japan. So here's something really interesting. So the Jews found sanctuary in Shanghai. They didn't need visas. But then China was taken over by the Japanese, who were allied with the Nazis. So once again, the Jewish refugees felt very threatened because of the Nazis' alliance with Japan, which occupied at that time Beijing, and with good reason, as we know. The Fridas were then instrumental in organizing a committee in Manila to rescue Jews in Shanghai. It was called the Jewish Refugee Committee of Manila. That summer, though, something interesting happened, and this did not happen much. The German government actually sent a ship to evacuate Jews from Shanghai to Manila, and that brought 30 families. They paid for it, so that was a very interesting situation, because it freed up money that the Frieders were raising to bring Jewish refugees in, and they were able to redirect that money to bring refugees from other countries, mainly from Germany. So that precipitated this full plan to start bringing the refugees here. So let's get this. So this is a plan to get the Jewish refugees to Manila that has a lot of legends associated with it, and they're in books and stories and all that. But let's see what we can learn about how it actually worked. Did the plan to rescue the Jews from Germany take shape at a poker table where the Frieder brothers played and shared their cigars alongside the power elites? That was one theory. Did President Kazan initiate the offer? That's another, we don't know. Did High Commissioner Paul McNutt devise the plan? And was General Dwight Eisenhower involved at all? That's also part of the stories that I've read about. So here are the facts, and these are according to historian Bonnie Harris, who actually did her PhD dissertation on Cantor Chisner from the Jewish community, and in doing that, did a lot of research about how the community grew and how it was rescued. So the key players were the Refugee Economic Corporation in New York City, Paul McNutt, President Kazan, the Frieder brothers, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in New York City. According to Bonnie, Dwight Eisenhower, as much as a hero as he was certainly to us, and he was an up-and-coming general at that time, was not involved in this rescue. In 1938, McNutt arranged for 100 German Jewish families to receive visas without US State Department interference. Now that is super important. Any of you who have family who came over during that period know that there was a great deal of US State Department interference and bureaucracy for anyone to go through to try to get out of Europe during that time. And my grandparents on my father's side were actually denied admission and were murdered in the Holocaust because of that. So doing something without the US State Department interference was really quite, maybe he endangered his own job, I don't know. But how did this all work? So the REC, the committee, advanced funds in conjunction with the Joint Distribution Committee to meet these stipulations that the refugees not become public charges. That was very common, still common for immigrants, that they have someone who can support them until they can get on their feet. McNutt's role and his support for the rescue was absolutely key to its success. And if he isn't already, he should probably be one of the righteous Gentiles who are honored in Israel at Yad Vashem. The leaders of the Jewish community developed a list of 100 families that could readily assimilate. And they needed doctors, nurses, engineers, anyone with a trade that could assimilate, would have a ready job, etc. Now, remember, this is during the 30s, so the war hadn't started yet. We're talking about June 39. So in 39, 750 Jewish refugees had arrived. Elsie and Gunther were there somehow by the end of 38, and they're not on these lists. As I said, I've done a lot of research and still haven't found them and how they actually got into the country. So this plan became a sponsorship program, and we've heard of sponsors for immigrants in our country. So they raised funds to help support these families that needed it, and it became a model for other rescue efforts. But while Jews were being turned away from nations all around the world, the Philippines came to their rescue, and they would have actually rescued many more if it weren't for the war starting. There were plans to bring 10,000 Jews to the other large island in the Philippines called Mindanao, and it fell through. It was never able to be completed. So let me just X that. So they came to Manila, and it was going to be a new life. And here's a picture of some of those immigrants and refugees who came to Manila. And what did they find? Well, some of the things that they found were, or that they were able to have in Manila were the same as they had in Europe. Rabbi Joseph Schwartz and Cantor Chisner, who were also refugees, led the growing congregation. Chisner gave piano lessons. He prepared the boys for bar mitzvah. They had holiday festivities. They had these ritual circumcisions for boys who were being born in Manila. The Sabbath services went on. They had medical care from German doctors. I mean, could it be better? And they found jobs with American companies. Remember, there are lots of American influences there. The streets were named for Americans. I forgot to point out that in Manila on that map, one of the main boulevards is Dewey Boulevard, named after Commodore Dewey. And I think it has a new name now, but everyone, I think, from Manila knows Dewey Boulevard. So here's another example of what life was like before World War II in Manila. We have the Santa Ana Cabaret here, which was hosting, it looks like a big military ball. It looks like all American military, women in long gowns. And it's just a magnificent setting, just beautiful place. But they also found life very different. It didn't look that glamorous. So Elsie and Gunther apparently took a little outing one day and went to the countryside, and they encountered oxen, and it looks like they were having a good time. And I think this photo was used by the library for promoting this program. So I thought this was pretty charming to see this. So the Manila, which was called the Pearl of the Orient, was just a lovely city. But it wasn't home. It wasn't Germany. It wasn't Northern Europe. The newly arrived residents came here and they weren't accustomed to the heat. It was hot and very muggy, and it was very different from what they knew. They encountered tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, prickly heat. It was something they had to get used to. It was very hard. Life moved at a much slower pace. Germans, especially most of them were German Jews. They're accustomed to, their custom is to be very prompt. And they had to adapt because that wasn't the custom in the Philippines. 9 a.m. start of work might be 9:30 a.m. start, or even noon. So they had to get used to that. The community wasn't large enough for them to have their own school. So they had to send their children to the two most popular Catholic schools, and they had to bargain and negotiate with the priests who ran the schools and the nuns that their children would not have to take catechism and other subjects, other religions subjects there. So it was kind of, they were, kind of treading gently in their new home. But overall, like Lottie Hirschfield said, the Filipinos welcomed them with open arms. They were warm, wonderful people. And here are a couple of photos. I want you to remember these in your head. This is a bridge in Manila, was a bridge, a beautiful piece of architecture, again, that they had built. And this theater, the Metropolitan Theater, was probably a center of cultural life and entertainment with palm trees outside and looks like some shops. Just a beautiful city. That's why it was called the Pearl of the Orient. But, the clouds of war were looming. The war had started September 1st, 1939, and still the Jews felt safe where they were, but all that was about to change very, very quickly. On December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese began bombing Manila. They sank the ships, the American ships. They bombed the airfield, the American airfield. The refugees were completely baffled. They asked, where is the U.S. Army Air Force to protect them? Where were they? Back in the US, of course, as we know, the US was preoccupied with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And how many of us knew that 2 days later, Manila was bombed? Probably not a lot of us, but it was another surprise attack. And MacArthur was there, and he would soon leave. Not only that, the Philippine Constabulary started arresting the German Jews because they thought they were allied with the Nazis, but they were quickly released once that relationship was explained. Soon there were 30,000 Japanese troops all over Manila occupying it. No businesses were open. Some of the Jewish families actually had to leave their homes. And General MacArthur declared Manila an open city and basically abandoned it on December 26th and said it would no longer be defended. So quite a change in turn of events. So Elsie, many years later, when she was in the US, and we'll talk about that later, gave her stepdaughter a narrative. She told her stepdaughter the story of what happened. And now that I've done all this research, I see how close it is to exactly what happened. The war came to the Philippines and to Manila, and suddenly the Japanese were in control of everything. All their American friends and families were interred in the Japanese concentration camp. And irony of ironies, Mr. and Mrs. Hamburger were considered to be Germans and therefore allies of the Japanese. We're not interested in Germany's religious problems, said the Japanese officer who examined their German passports. So they were free to live in their home during the occupation. It's a difficult time at best for all, and food and things to meet their basic needs were very scarce and difficult to come by. So that's how Elsie told her story. So from 1942 to 45 was very grim. The opening of the U.S. Army quartermaster stores precipitated violent riots, and immediately the Japanese declared martial law. They said every citizen who was from a country at war with Japan had to be imprisoned, and that included Cantor Chisner. Now, Cantor Chisner was from Germany, but he was originally from Poland, and he had a Polish passport, even though he had been raised in Germany by his family. He might have even been born in Germany, but being born in Germany did not automatically confer a German citizenship on you. So he was first arrested, but the rabbi was able to meet with the Japanese army representatives from the religious section, and they were able to get Cantor Chisner out. What happened during the occupation? Well, they were cut off from the rest of the world, and the Jewish community had to really come together even more strongly. They had to help each other, the people who couldn't survive on their own. They had to deliver their own health care, which they mostly were doing. They found medications to at least for a couple of years. The temple stayed open, but there were curfews. There was no transportation. The food prices went through the roof, and the Chinese merchants who were at that time, I guess, running those warehouses made out well, as there's always someone who makes out well in wartime. So they had barely any money to buy food. The war continued, and people are familiar, Americans are familiar with the Bataan Death March in 1942, which resulted in the deaths of 10,000 American and Filipino soldiers. It's a famous, terrible time in the Philippines. But what was going on around them in Manila and elsewhere was also very difficult. They did have Yom Kippur 1942. Somehow the Japanese allowed 50 imprisoned Jews to attend services at Temple Amiel. But this quote from Frank Ephraim in his book shows how melancholy and sad that Yom Kippur was. Very sad. They felt united, but they didn't know what was to come. They were living under a fascist regime at that point. So 3 years of this are happening. And in 1944, finally, General MacArthur is returning to the Philippines as promised. And as story has it now, This photo was shot and shot a number of times to get it right. And MacArthur was his best PR man, his own PR man. And his legacy hasn't done really well. And in the book Rampage, which I'm going to talk about, he doesn't, fare very well, let's put it that way. So what happened to this wonderful, beautiful city during that battle? Well, the 29-day battle began on February 3rd, 1945, a few months after MacArthur actually landed. And it looked like it was going to be pretty successful, but instead of surrendering, the Rear Admiral Iwabuchi ordered his men to fight to the death, and not to their own death only, but to everyone's death. And from this review of James M. Scott's book, Rampage, which I'll talk about, is this kind of sums it up. They methodically dynamited Manila's business, government, and religious landmarks, obliterating the city's cultural heritage, torched thousands of wooden homes, sparking a deadly firestorm. They cruelly tortured and killed thousands of men, women, and children. It was truly, truly a disaster. And it was a Holocaust. 100,000 civilians were murdered. The city was destroyed. And among the dead were 80 members of the Jewish community, including Elsie's husband, Gunther. How did Elsie escape? She's escaping another Holocaust. So from her memoir that she told to her stepdaughter, I had these words. One day the bombs started falling. The Americans were liberating Manila. Everyone ran out of their homes onto the streets to escape the bombs and find the Americans, hoping to run away from the Japanese who were killing everyone on sight. Unknowingly, Elsie and Gunther ran into the Japanese-held part of the city. Gunther received a direct hit. Elsie could do nothing. He bled to death in front of her. Elsie ran for her life. She hid and witnessed the killings, sometimes playing dead as bayonets were heaved into bodies around her. She was hit by napalm and had to tear off her burning clothes and throw away the valuables she tried to save. She had literally absolutely nothing at the end of the war. So if you remember those beautiful photographs of Manila and how cosmopolitan it looked, this is what it looked like after the war, block after block after block of devastation. Everything was burned. This is an area called the Walled City, I believe, in Manila, and you can see there's barely a roof remaining. And this is that beautiful theater I showed you earlier, the Metropolitan Theater, and what it looked like after the war, after that battle. It was completely burned. Those windows are out. I mean, just tragedy, just a tragedy. Eventually, Elsie heard voices. She said it sounded like young men trying to talk with hot potatoes in their mouths. That's what she told her stepdaughter. She recognized it as English. Elsie crawled up a hill to them, wounded and naked while being fired upon by the Japanese. The GIs covered her with a blanket. She was taken to a hospital and slowly recovered. She bore the burn scars for the rest of her life. And here is a photo she sent home. Elsie, August 1945, she wrote on the back, "Here you can see me as I look now. Do you think I have changed? Love, Elsa." Manila, August 1945. And you can see she became a blonde for the rest of her life. She was a bleached blonde. Another interesting thing about Elsie is that she changed the year of her birth at some point after leaving Germany or before, and she changed it from 1909 to 1911. But I have birth records for her, and she was born in 1909. Kept her birthday, March 3rd. So interesting. So what happened in the aftermath to Manila? Manila was the scene of the worst urban fighting in the Pacific Theater. Japanese forces committed mass murder. The city's architectural and cultural heritage was destroyed. The battle ended March 3rd, but the fighting continued for a little bit after that. Thousands of civilians who were imprisoned were released finally on February 3rd, and they included an American who'd been president of the Jewish community, and remember Morton Netzwerg, who'd arrived as a teacher in 1911, as well as some other Jews. So Morton was still living at the end of the war, And I'd be interested to know what happened to his family and his son who was bar mitzvahed. The Jewish community began to regroup, believe it or not. A Passover Seder was led by Cantor Chisner and Rabbi Schwartz at the San Lazaro racetrack. Can you imagine? Thousands and thousands of U.S. servicemen and women came to a Passover Seder. Is that amazing? And then, unfortunately, though, on the other end, the sad news was that many Jews would soon learn that their family members that they had left behind in Europe were murdered. Many of them made plans to emigrate to the U.S. In July 46, the Philippines finally becomes an independent nation, led by Manuel Quezon. What happened to the temple? Well, you can see here what it looked like. It was devastated, just like most of the rest of the city. And this photo and this little notation here gives me, makes me kind of teary. November 45, American soldiers gathered with the remnants of the Jewish community for a memorial service. The GIs raised money to rebuild the synagogue, which is now called Temple Yaakov and located in a different section of the city. So really, we should be very grateful to all that they did. It's just amazing that they were able to do this. So I normally, when I first started doing this program over a year ago, I would pretty much end it here. But something drove me to keep doing research because I felt like I could still learn a little more. So I finally got hold of, thank you, Melissa, from the library, of this book, Rampage, James M. Scott's book, which I previously only had one of the reviews of. And through an interlibrary loan, I was able to borrow it because I thought maybe his book could shed some light about the Jewish community. Maybe he wrote a little bit about it. I didn't know, or had some of the familiar names and everything. So I began reading it this past February. And it's very gruesome. It's very graphic. It includes the eyewitness accounts of many, many survivors of that horrible battle. And I couldn't get through it. I'm sorry, James, if you're here, if you're watching this, but I couldn't get through the whole thing page by page. It was very graphic. So I was about to return it to the library when it was due. And I thought, well, that's kind of silly. I need to really look at it a little more closely. And I thought I would read 100 pages at least of footnotes in the back of this 600 plus page book and look through the index and see if I saw anything familiar, or he talked about the Jewish community, or he talked about the rabbi, whatever, and the cantor, or some of the names that were in the other book I had read, Escape to Manila by Frank Effring. So I thought maybe I could do some cross-referencing. So I started reading it, and I'm going through these, the index, and what do I find in the index? But my grandmother in the index. I'm like looking at this book in my kitchen, and I started literally screaming. It's almost as excited as I got the day I actually found my grandmother when I was doing my research back in 1997. And there's Elsie's name with 2 references to her. I was just amazed in this book by this famous author. There's my grandmother. So here's the excerpt that James M. Scott included. I learned that Elsie had sworn testimony, also noted in the footnotes of his book, to the US military, because they were interviewing survivors in order to build a case of war crimes against the Japanese because of that battle. So here's the excerpt that James M. Scott includes in his book on page 320 about Elsie. I will read it out loud. The promise of safety forced desperate residents like 34-year-old Elsie Hamburger on an odyssey across an apocalyptic wasteland toward American lines. Her path illuminated by the fiery red glow, so much like what she told her stepdaughter. Along the way, the German immigrant had seen her husband killed by shrapnel, a toddler speared on the end of a bayonet, and more than a dozen bound men pushed into an inferno. The Japanese seemed to be absolutely wild, she recalled. I could hear the screams and moans of those being burned. Finally, she reached the dividing line between the two forces. On one side, she spied two Japanese troops who opened fire on her with a machine gun, which is what she told her stepdaughter. Across the street, she saw an American soldier and the hope of rescue. I arose on my hands and knees, tore off my clothes, crawled across the street. Before I passed out, I took this American soldier in my arms and kissed him. God bless America, she said. Wow, I mean, I thought that needs to be in a movie. Elsie needs to be in a movie for sure. And this is what a page from the testimony looked like. After finding this, of course, I immediately found contact information for the author, for James Scott, and wrote to him and said, is there any way you can help me get the full testimony? And he had it, and he sent it to me. And it's 7 pages, not easy to read, of testimony that were secret for many years and now are open in the United States Archives in Maryland. And this is her Q&A with the interrogators in 1945. Very graphic testimony. I actually typed this in from one of the pages because it's too difficult to read. But here she's talking about pretending to be dead and watching bayonets going into the bodies of other people that the Japanese thought were still alive. I mean, it breaks your heart. I can't imagine she didn't have PTSD for the rest of her life. The Japanese killed all the civilians that they thought were alive. And she said the Japanese, as quoted in James' book, Japanese seemed to be absolutely wild. So what happened to Elsie after the war? Well, I found her POW record. So this is on file with the US government. They considered her a POW while she was in Manila because she was living under the Japanese. So even though they were allowed to live because they were Germans and allied with the Japanese, she was, of course, not that free to do anything. So she was a POW according to the US. Then finally, after being nursed back to health, she boarded a boat, the SS Cable Splice, probably a merchant marine vessel. She was considered stateless, although someone later wrote into the passenger manifest that she was formerly German. She gave her name Elsie Marie Hamburger. Her full name was Elsa Marie Sophie Gobel Hamburger. So she boarded this boat in 1946. And where does she go? She has a sister in Beverly Hills, of all places. And what a difference, right? Well, there were still palm trees, but that's probably the only similarity between the Manila she left and the US she arrived in. In 1947, she filed her Declaration of Intention. This is available on the internet. And I learned a little more about Elsie from this. I did learn her actual wedding date, November 7th, 1938. And I learned a little more about Gunther, when he was born, where he was from, and that, and I knew already that he was deceased. And she had her address, where she was then living at the time in 1947. A year later, she married a widower, Manny Fredkin, who had 4 children, and they were living in I believe, Encino, California. I think that's next to LA. So in 1948, little did Elsie know, and of course my mother didn't know, but my mother also was married in New York City in 1948. Elsie became a citizen in 1950, and my mother became a citizen in 1950 on the opposite coast. So unbelievable, coincidences. They were both Holocaust survivors, of course. Later pictures, here she is. I believe this is in California with her sister Nellie, who lived in New York. This is in the 1950s. Here's Elsie on the left and her sister Nellie, who had lived in Palestine for a while and then emigrated to the US. And I actually did get to meet Nellie. She was still alive when I found the family in 1997. Here she is visiting her nephew, Mike, in, of all places, Old Bridge, literally down the street, less than 4 miles from where I live. And in 1970, I was up the road in New Brunswick going to Douglas College. So I would have never known that I had a grandmother. I didn't even know that, who was visiting her nephew right down the road. She died in Arizona in 1995 at the actual age of 86, though she had changed her age to 84. She's buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glenwood, California, next to her second husband, Manny. Gunther is memorialized on a plaque in the Jewish section of the Cementerio del Norte in Manila, which contains the names of all the Jews killed in the Battle of Liberation, and his name is right here. And when I found this, actually, there's a photo of this plaque in the Frank Ephraim book, and it was the first time I actually saw anything in writing about Gunther or Elsie being in Manila, even though I knew they had been there. So for decades after World War II, this story of the Jewish community in Manila was really known primarily to Holocaust scholars and to the descendants of the families who actually lived there. It wasn't really well known, certainly wasn't as well known as the Shanghai refugees. But thanks to recent scholarship and documentary filmmakers like Noel Izon, and recognition of the Philippines and Israel, this story is finally more widely known, and hopefully my program is making it even more widely known. But I'd like to thank the late Frank Ephraim, who wrote this book. It was the first book that I found, called Escape to Manila. Unfortunately, he passed away maybe about 18 years ago or so. Historian Bonnie Harris at San Diego State University wrote her dissertation about Cantor Chisner and provided excellent information for me, which I've incorporated into this presentation. I'd like to thank Noel Sonny Izon. And then there was also a film called Rescue in the Philippines, which was based on the Frieder brothers, a 2010 film. And I got a lot of photos on the internet that I, now knowing what to look for, found quite a bit, including those after the war photos. And absolutely special thanks to Rob Hamburger, who really inspired me to go and do this research after this serendipitous meeting via, through someone on Facebook who gave me a clue that I followed up and found Rob. And to James Scott, if he's here, for actually giving Elsie a real place in history. And if you ever meet a Filipino, and I know there are a lot of Filipinos around here in East Brunswick, say thank you. And that's my presentation, and I would be very happy to answer questions. Do I have any questions? Leonie is here, and James is not, Lottie is not, but Leonie Kramer, want to say hello? Hi.
Got it.
Hi, so nice to meet you.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. And I just want to say what a great job you did on this presentation. And it's really a pleasure. So I'm representing my mom. She's having technical difficulties. She's going to be 90 in January, and she has trouble with Zoom. But she did call me when you began and said to say hello to everybody and to just say how appreciative she is to the Philippines and to you and to people that tell this story. So you did a great job, and I really appreciate your sharing the story because people don't know this story. Mm-hmm. And for me, probably one of the nicest things, I live in Southern California. We have a large Filipino community out here. I can't tell you how much joy and pleasure it gives me to tell young Filipinos, especially, this story. And they're so touched every time I tell them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming. And we'll have a recording of this. I could send that to your mom.
Oh, she'd love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for coming. Are there any other questions? I see in the chat. Let me see. Someone asked, did the Jews integrate into the Philippines? They had their own community. I can't really answer that. Leonie, maybe you know a little more. There was, I think there might have been some intermarriages. I don't know.
Okay. That much I don't know about. I think most people left after the war, but I did have, my mother has some friends. They call each other Manilaners. Those are Jews that went to Manila, emigres, and some of them stayed quite a while after the war and reestablished businesses. And so I have some second generation Manilaner friends who are in their early 70s. They were born there. So some of them stayed and some of them had children there. And that was interesting. The other thing I just want to mention, I meant to tell you this before. If you'd like, have you seen the book, Sandy, about Paul McNutt by Dean Kotlowski? Have you seen that book?
No, but
I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat because he's a fascinating character, and I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to. I wonder, he should be recognized as a righteous Gentile for what he did, cutting through that red tape. That was really important. Someone asked, how did my mother know that Elsie was her real mother? Well, my mother actually got her birth certificate when she sent to Germany in 1950 or before that. She needed her birth certificate to become a citizen, and they sent her back the birth certificate with Elsie's name on it. And she had always suspected that she was adopted, but her parents never admitted to it. So it was a shock, and it wasn't a shock to her. So that's how she knew. And she had her name, we had Elsie's name. And then after her adoptive mother died, she acquired all of her adoption papers. And that's what I used to do my search. And I have another program all about that part of my research that I can give if anyone's interested. So if the library wants me to do that one, I will. It's called Finding Family Dead or Alive. Be happy to do that one too. When did my grandmother go to the Philippines? She went in, according to the testimony, interestingly, it says she arrived in late 1938. So she was already there. And again, I still don't know how she got there, but I'm going to follow some leads. Thank you for the compliments. Let's see if there's any other questions. Yes, there will be a taping. Definitely. This has been recorded, as Melissa mentioned earlier, so that will be available. I don't know how they make
the website that it will be at is ebpl.org/YouTube. It'll take me a few days to get up because we're uploading everything that we've recorded in the past few weeks.
/YouTube. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. That's really good to know. And I'll be sending that link to people who weren't able to attend tonight. What's the Jewish population now, and is it active? It's small, but they do have a synagogue called Temple Yaakov, but I don't really know much else about it. Noel Izon, the filmmaker, told me a little bit about it. The reason this is a little interesting side story, he told me, the reason he did the film, and he is a filmmaker, was because his father's life as a baby was saved by a Jewish physician in Manila. And he wondered why and how there were Jews in Manila. I guess it was a European German doctor. And he felt grateful because he felt that he wouldn't be here if that Jewish doctor had not saved his father's life. So that's what prompted him to do the research and do the film, An Open Door, which I haven't seen in its entirety yet. I would very much like to. Thank you.